Starting the recording now. Okay, so yeah. So for this last of our review things, I want to talk about the different revolutions. Not political revolutions, but social or economic or intellectual revolutions. Kind of big complexes of changes that totally transform Europe, either socially or economically or technologically, or usually all three. Um, these are kind of big and abstract, uh, like composites of different ideas, but they usually stand for like long-term processes rather than any one specific set of technological changes or ideas or anything like that. So they kind of are more like markers for I guess like markers for much larger social processes. And being able to unpack what they mean helps you to kind of get a kind of deeper and more nuanced sense of what is changing in European history. So for Unit 1, I want to start by talking about general demographic and economic trends. So the big context here is that Unit 1 takes place in the wake of the Black Death. In the 1330s, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population dies. And this actually turns out to be a great thing for most of the population because the population is largely farmers. There's not a lot of technology available to increase the productivity of farming per acre. So the only way that you can support a larger population is by farming in worse and worse locations. So when the Black Death occurs, you see the productivity of farming go up because all farming labor is now concentrated in the best farming locations. And what this means is that in the wake of the Black Death, you actually see a period of rapid population growth. So basically from 1450 to 1600, you see rapid population growth. And also fairly solid levels of prosperity at the beginning. But as population grows, prosperity actually declines. And that is for the exact same reason that I just mentioned. During this time period, there is not really any technologies available to increase the productivity per acre of farms. So a larger population just means you have to split the good farmland among more people. And so during this time period, you're actually seeing more and more people living in the countryside on the very edge of starvation. People who are farming on hilltops, people who are farming in swamps, thieves, vagabonds, all sorts of stuff. So those are some general trends during this time period. Another very important trend during this time period is the so increasing trade and commercialization, and so that's going to be very important, and we'll of course talk about that more when we get to the commercial revolution. And the last thing is important to remember is a shift in commerce from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The Atlantic becomes the key center of world commerce with the discovery of the Americas and the circumnavigation of Africa. I don't know if it counts as a circumnavigation, but with the Atlantic as the key area of world trade, you see the rise of ports in Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England, and the decline of Italy and other Mediterranean port cities. Okay, so the first big economic and social revolution that we talk about in the class is known as the Price Revolution. And it basically goes from like 1500 till around 1600. In many ways, the Price Revolution is like the beta period for the commercial revolution. And we'll talk about why that is and what that means here in a second. So the main causes for the price revolution is the increase of trade in Europe and the increase of commercial activity, combined with increasing amounts of silver coming in from the Americas. Spain is mining and spending so much silver that they are actually causing inflation. And this is a new phenomenon. Because economic growth is so slow in Europe, prices basically stay the same constantly over whole individuals' lifetimes. So before 1500, you could have taken a coin and buried it in the backyard and dug it up 100 years later, and the coin would have lost zero value. Gold was gold, silver was silver, and the amount of stuff that you could buy didn't vary. This changes with the price revolution. And because more and more silver is entering into the economy, you start to see low rates of inflation. These rates of inflation are now taken to be basically normal in the modern world. Like rates of 2 to 3% of inflation is basically just considered normal. And we actually consider it a problem economically if deflation occurs. And so this is actually, this little bit of inflation is actually very good for the economic development of Europe, and for a couple of reasons. So I'll get to the impacts here in a second. But so to review causes, it's basically Spanish silver, increasing commercialization leads to inflation, and inflation leads to a number of other social shifts. So the number one biggest impact of the price revolution is that inflation forces investment. If you want to stay rich, see my typing, I can't spell anything. If you want to stay rich, you have to invest your money. You have to figure out ways to generate returns on your capital that are greater than the inflation rate. And so what this means is that inflation acts as a kind of selection pressure in European societies. If you are not investing your wealth at a rate that is at least equal to inflation, gradually your fortunes will decline and you will cease to matter as an economic entity in Europe. On the other hand, if you can figure out a way to invest your money that is greater than the inflation rate, this will lead to you gradually growing it in importance. And so this leads to a number of important things. So first of all, it leads to commercialized agriculture, especially near cities. A second thing is it leads to increasing attempts to invest in new sectors. So one of the most obvious ones is investment in trade. Third, this means that traditional elites will tend to decline, whereas mercantile types, so traders, people who are in a position to take advantage of new economic opportunities, are going to rise. And so, for example, in Britain, you're going to see the rise of the gentry as people who are either investing in commercial agriculture or people who are investing in trade. And these are commoners who are able to make enough money through their investments to basically function as noblemen. And in France, you're going to see the French bourgeoisie emerge. And one of the key driving factors in the French Revolution is that the French bourgeoisie are continually gaining economic power, but they are not gaining commensurate political power. And the French Revolution is largely an attempt to adjust political power to be equal to economic power. So this is a long-term trend. Inflation leads to new types of investment, and new types of investment eventually drive social and political transformation. Okay, let's see what else. All right, I think that's pretty much all you need to know for the price revolution. Questions there? All right, let's go on to the commercial revolution then. So the commercial revolution, guys, refers to a set of economic developments that occur in the Netherlands and Britain. And it's basically limited to there. These developments will spread later to the rest of Europe. But when it starts, this is a localized phenomenon occurring in Amsterdam and London, largely. And so the time period here is about 1600 to 1650. And they're going to develop the basic tools that make capitalism possible. So the causes here are multiple things. But first of all, the price revolution is a major thing. So that's why I would say that the price revolution is in some ways just the beginning of the commercial revolution. Is the inflation rates then kick off a number of social changes that ultimately result in the development of these new economic techniques. So a second important cause is that in both Britain and the Netherlands, there is sort of a recognized role for the bourgeoisie or for commoners. So like, I guess you could say like weak nobility in Netherlands and England allows for rise of commoners. Also, the mercantile focus of both the British and the Dutch economies is crucial. Most of these breakthroughs in the commercial revolution are to facilitate commerce and trade. So if you are a country that is largely focused on agricultural production, these breakthroughs are not going to be as significant. Although we will see in the agricultural revolution that agriculture is also a form of commerce. You're producing for a market and stuff like that. So what we should probably really go through here is we should probably list some innovations. Anybody want to list innovations that the Dutch come up with? There's like 5 or 6 that I think you should probably know. You want me to do it? Okay. All right, well, you got your stock markets, AKA joint stock companies. You got insurance. You got accounting. You got national banks. You got entrepot economics. That is to say, using warehouses. Basically, the Dutch just collect goods from all over the place, hold them, and then sell them at a higher rate. So they're starting to figure out that the key to commerce is waiting for markets to vary enough to allow for the buying of things very cheaply and the selling of things very dearly. And so entrepot economics, basically for a while, Amsterdam is just hoarding most of the resources of Northern Europe and redistributing them to places where demand is highest. So they're buying wood from Sweden where there's way too much wood and selling it in Spain where there's not enough wood. They're buying grain from Poland and selling it in London where there's not enough grain. So they're redistributing resources and using the market and prices as a way of figuring out where it is that these goods need to be supplied.
Were there privately held joint stock companies that weren't on the markets, but were like not just a single ship?
Yes. So most of the joint stock companies were not publicly traded um, corporations or anything like that. So to call what they were doing in to call what they were doing in the Netherlands or in London a stock market is kind of an oversimplification. You could sometimes buy and sell shares for joint stock companies, but most of them were not publicly traded. A lot of what's actually being traded in the Dutch markets is futures rather than stock in companies. Um, so you're basically betting on the prices of future goods and stuff like that. But I would say that the majority of joint stock companies are actually privately held.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So okay, so the impacts here are huge. Um, and it's big for both individuals and it's big for politics. Um, so I think the first and the most important thing is to think about the political impact. Uh, for a couple things. The strength of a nation during this time period is largely determined not by its population, not by its natural resources, but by its ability to tax. If a state can tax its citizens sustainably more than other citizens, or than other countries, it will win because money is power during this time period. You just straight up buy your armies. You just go to a mercenary and buy your army, and that's how you fight wars. Um, so this leads to rapid economic growth, which leads to a larger tax base. Second, it allows governments to borrow money from the population very cheaply. So that's one of the key things about the national bank. The national bank collects saved money from all of the citizens of the country and puts it into the national bank, and then the bank can lend money out to the government. So the government can borrow money from the bank, and as long as they always pay these bonds back, they can do so at very, very low rates. So one reason that Britain is able to beat France in a number of wars is because Britain is able to continually borrow money at like 3 or 4%, whereas the French kings are being forced to borrow money from private creditors at rates of like 15 or 20%. And that is just completely unsustainable. And so because interest rates are much lower, the Dutch and the English are able to borrow more money and go deeper into debt and to basically win wars of monetary attrition against France and Spain, depending on which war you're looking at. So this is a crucial ability. The ability to go into debt and to borrow money basically allows monarchs to fight wars as frequently and with as much duration as they need. So the economic impacts are also really important. So first of all, this allows for the investment of capital in diverse and productive fields. So before the commercial revolution, there really wasn't a clear way to invest money. In almost every country, the only way that you really invested money was you just tried to buy land. But in many cases, this wasn't even possible because most land was held either by the church or by hereditary nobles. So it's not like you could just go out shopping for estates. These things were hard to come by. So even if you did have money, it wasn't necessarily clear how you could turn that money into more money. With the commercial revolution, though, that all changes. There's banks where you can invest. There's banks where you can house your money safely, and then there are markets where you can go and invest in ships or in futures or in various types of joint stock companies. So this allows for average or common people to begin investing their money and growing their money. And so this is crucial. And so in terms of social change, the biggest thing here is that this leads to the rise of the bourgeoisie. It is an alternate route to wealth. Rather than owning land and exploiting peasants, you can instead own ships and, like, participate in the slave trade and stuff like that. And also, commercial shipping then gives rise to all sorts of other new industries as well, including like shipbuilding and warehousing. And then as cities grow, agriculture becomes more profitable because you have to sell food to these cities and stuff like that. Okay, last thing on here, this isn't really a revolution. It's just important for you to know about. The Little Ice Age basically goes for the entirety of the 1600s. For about 100 years, the world just gets colder. Scientists are not sure why this happens. It's very weird. Maybe it'll happen again soon. That would be nice. I don't think it's going to. But for about 100 years, the world is just colder, like significantly colder. In a couple of cases, it seems like some northern ports freeze over and do not melt for the entirety of the summer. So like some of the Baltic and Russian ports just freeze over during this time period. So the causes here, we don't know. It's a mystery. Some people say it's because of the massive death of Native American populations who had been engaging in large-scale burnings of eastern North American forests. I don't know if that's actually substantiated. But so the impacts here are a couple things. The main one is you see population decline during this time period. And the 16th century is famous as a time of conflict and war. And some people have suggested that while many of the conflicts seem to have like religious bases or dynastic bases, that actually much of these struggles are rooted ultimately in just declining productivity and resource scarcity. And this is actually the last time in European history that population declines significantly. Although I think we're looking at that happening again here real soon. All right, so that's it for Unit 1. For Unit 2, we got to look at the agricultural revolution and we got to look at the scientific revolution. So the agricultural revolution basically goes from 1650 till 1800. Oh, and one thing that's very important to point out is that most of these revolutions only happen in Western Europe. Germany is slow on all of this, and Russia and Austria are way behind on pretty much all of this stuff. So the agricultural revolution basically only happens in England and the Netherlands. Agriculture remains much more traditional everywhere else. And part of the reason for that is that the agricultural revolution is really the application of capitalist methods of production to agriculture during this time period. So one of the main causes is the commercial revolution. And to make that a little more clear, what I mean by that is that this is the use of capital to increase the productivity and profitability of farming. So up until 1650, farming took place in a very traditional way and was basically allowed to continue according to medieval peasant practices. But once the commercial revolution happens, the bourgeoisie realized that farming could be made far more productive by changing production methods and by investing capital into these production methods. Another issue here is the growth of cities provides much larger markets for farmers. So you're going to see a shift towards a much greater emphasis on commercial rather than subsistence agriculture. Okay, so there's a couple important takeaways here. Oh, well, before we get to this, we should talk about what they actually do. What actual changes do they implement? So the first thing and the most important thing that happens in England is the Enclosure Act, or it's rather the Acts of Enclosure. And so common lands that were held by villages, are basically just put up for sale, and large landowners are allowed to buy up. Large landowners, successful gentry, that is commoners with spare cash, are able to buy up the common lands. This is crucial. This is really the first step towards the rationalization of agriculture. These common lands, basically anybody who lived in the village was allowed to use them. And so you'd have like random potato fields. You'd have like a couple random goats just wandering around on these commons. People would hunt on them. People would harvest wood from them. And so the commons played a very important role in the life of the village. However, they were definitely not being used to their utmost productive capacity. And people were pointing out and arguing in Parliament that if a wealthy person with some capital was allowed to buy these lands, they could drain the lands, they could fence them off, they could subdivide them, they could invest in soil maintenance, manuring and weeding and all of that stuff. And these lands, instead of producing like a couple goats and some potatoes every year, would instead be able to produce bushels and bushels of grain. And these arguments eventually went out, and Parliament allows these ancient commons that have existed since the Middle Ages to be wiped out and bought up by the most successful landowners. This is crucial because without this, many of the other changes would not have been able to occur. Now that you have large enclosed spaces that belong to individual investors, it now makes sense for them to begin investing capital to increase agricultural productivity. What are some other changes that you get? Well, you get selective breeding of livestock. You get better crop rotation, the introduction of fodder crops, and green fertilizers. That is stuff like peas and alfalfa. These are legumes that actually restore nitrogen to the soil. Then you can feed these crops to your animals, which then allows you to produce animal products for the market and also to produce manure, which then you can put into the soil to increase soil productivity even further. So you get this beneficial cycle where the crops that you're growing actually allow you to grow more crops in the future. Oh, and the last thing is certain mechanical innovations. The most famous one is the seed drill, invented in the Netherlands, that allows for a single worker to put basically sow an entire field and to get much greater yields per seed. Rather than just scattering the seeds randomly, you instead are planting each seed deliberately in a row, which allows for much greater efficiency per seed planted. And all of this together leads to grain yields that go from like 5 to 1 to like 12 to 1. I guess it would be 1 to 5 or. So what that means is that before the agricultural revolution, for each seed that you planted, you got 5 seeds back. And then of course you have to eat some of those seeds, and then you got to give away some of those seeds in planting. So you really don't, but anyway, after all of this, productivity has more than doubled. This leads to some massive impacts. First of all is the displacement of poor rural workers, and that leads to urbanization. It leads to population growth, both in the countryside and in the cities, because as the population grows in the cities, more and more people end up moving or as population grows in the countryside, more and more people end up moving to the cities. So a second impact here is that population growth leads to lower labor costs. And lower labor costs are what first make factory production possible. It's super cheap to employ these desperate workers. They will accept pretty much any job. And so working in a factory becomes a thing that you can get people to do. Let's see. All right, I think that's pretty much it. Okay, scientific revolution. This is not really a major like economic or demographic thing, at least not in the short term, but just a quick reminder. The scientific revolution basically goes from like 1550 to 1688. So in many ways, this is actually a Unit 1 phenomenon. The 1550s, that's when Copernicus publishes his book on the heliocentric theory, and the 1688, actually it's 1687, is Newton publishes his theory of gravity. The causes of this, I don't know, it's kind of crazy to talk about the causes of science briefly, but I think we could probably just say Renaissance humanism. Geez, can't even spell the Renaissance. So you got Renaissance humanism, and also the Reformation is clearly a cause, as it leads to a search for some kind of certainty outside of religious dogma. So there's a number of massive impacts of the scientific revolution. It's silly, they're so huge, it's silly almost to try and summarize them. But I think a couple things here to remember is the alliance between the state and science. The state becomes one of the major institutions that funds scientific research. And scientific research becomes one of the main ways in which states expand their capacity for controlling their populations. Not just military technology, but also astronomy and navigation is crucial for improving infrastructure and for mapping out and controlling state territories. Engineering allows for all sorts of infrastructure projects to go forward. So that's crucial. Another key thing is this allows for industrial technology. And maybe the most important, I don't know, it's silly to suggest that one of these is more important, but is the Enlightenment. Europeans are so excited with the scientific revolution that many of them think that we are on the verge of bringing about some kind of utopia as a human species, and that science and rationality are not just going to improve our understandings of the natural world, but will also allow us to re-engineer society. So those are some basic things to think about with the scientific revolution. So some general demographic and economic trends for this time period. So you're seeing during this time period, you're seeing rapid population growth, and this is where population growth takes off and it doesn't stop. Agriculture is getting more productive, trade's getting more efficient, and as soon as the system starts to strain, we're then going to invent we're going to go through the Industrial Revolution, and then population is going to spike even further. So you see rapid population growth, you see increasing city populations. You also see increasing poverty. There are more and more people living on the edge of starvation. And this is leading to various social stresses. So there's lots of homelessness, there's lots of theft, there's lots of prostitution, basically people doing anything that they can to survive. And this leads to some of the first city planning and like city governance. So you see the rise of the first prisons, the first mental institutions, as ways of coping with poor populations. So I recognize it's 3 o'clock. I'm going to go through the first and second industrial revolutions real quick. If you need to log off, that's fine. I totally understand. And I will, of course, share the recorded video with you afterwards if you do want to hear my kind of silly oversimplifications of these last two things. So the first industrial revolution happens in Britain in like from the 1780s to around 1830. So the first industrial revolution basically refers to a set of technologies coming online. And these technologies are steam, mechanization, mass iron production, and the factory model. So these three technologies together give you cheap metal, a replacement for basic repetitive tasks, and something to power these machines with. Mechanization before steam power was okay, but your actual ability to power these machines was highly limited. So it's only when all three of these processes come online together that you have a recipe essentially for infinite economic growth. As long as you have coal and iron and people to sell stuff to, you're in business. The kind of epitome of the first industrial revolution is the development of the railroad. The railroad combines all of these technologies together into a world-shaking development. The ability for the first time in human history to transport large amounts of stuff at high speeds over land, which is a total game changer for how we plan cities and project power as societies and stuff like that. So the main causes here, I don't even know. Basically, every single one of these revolutions is a cause of the last one. So the Industrial Revolution would not have been possible without the Commercial Revolution. It would have not been possible without the Scientific Revolution. It would not have been possible without the Agricultural Revolution. So in some ways, all of these different revolutions represent kind of interlocking changes in the basic social structure of Europe. So basically just all the other revolutions. Now, specifically in Britain, of course, there were more factors at play. So parliamentary government was important because you had a protection of property, which is crucial if you want people to invest, water transport, and global markets. Global markets are important because if you don't have people to sell stuff to, businesses are going to go under. So the fact that Britain could not only sell stuff to its local population, but also to people all over the world, made it possible for them to continually expand production. And water transport was crucial for making factories possible before railroads. You had to be able to get huge amounts of material in and out of cities if you wanted to industrialize. And the only way you could do that before railroads was with a river. I don't even want to touch the impacts of the Industrial Revolution. It just changes literally everything. I'm not going to try and summarize it. But I do just want to quickly go over the second Industrial Revolution. So this is oftentimes pointed to as occurring around 1870. 1870 is just the kind of a key time when a whole bunch of new technologies come online at once. And it basically is completed by 1914. The key technologies here. So the key technologies here are you go from steam to electricity in terms of power, which has huge benefits. Now, instead of every factory having to have its own dirty coal-burning steam engine, you can have a massive steam turbine at the edge of town and pipe electricity in, which is way cleaner and way more efficient. In terms of materials, you go from iron to steel. Steel is not really that much more expensive than iron, but it's much stronger, has a much higher tensile strength, and allows for all sorts of new applications. For transport, you see the development of petroleum. So you get cars and airplanes. Also, rubber comes online as a key technology. So you get bikes. Oh, and electricity is also important because then you can have electric trolleys. And then also communication technologies. You see the rise of the radio and stuff like that. So these are all huge changes. And in fact, I would argue that in terms of their effect on the daily person's experience of life and quality of life, that the first industrial revolution really had a pretty minimal impact. And in some ways, it actually made life worse for people. The second industrial revolution is where things really start to get better for the average person. Things become cheaper, cleaner, more efficient. Wages start to go up, at least relative to how expensive everything is, and all of that stuff. The causes for this are really just the continued application of capitalist investment, scientific research. So in many ways, it doesn't make sense to distinguish between the first and the second industrial revolutions. It's just kind of a handy term for thinking about what would life have been like. So during the first industrial revolution, these are the technologies you're coping with. By 1870, by 1900, the world has been transformed by this next wave of technologies. Some historians are talking about us living through a third industrial revolution right now with the rise of computers and the internet and stuff. But yeah, so I don't think I want to go into causes and impacts, except maybe for one impact, I want you guys to know that the second industrial revolution actually does make life better for the average person. I don't think you'll need to know a lot of these little details here anyway. I just want you to have kind of a broad overview of kind of the demographic trends in these different time periods. So anybody have any questions for me? Anything you want to talk about before we go? All right. Did somebody just unmute themselves?